by in Red Hollow. There are certain names the wind prefers not to carry. One of them is hers. The widow I never needed to ask her real name. The whole town only knew her as this, the woman in the black veil. Whenever I passed the main street, I saw doors closing, curtains being drawn, and men lowering their eyes. Even the dogs stopped barking, as if they recognized in her something that didn't belong in this world. I saw those looks myself. I saw strong men, hardened by work and the sun, tremble at the mere mention of her name. They said she had a cold beauty, the kind that doesn't welcome, but holds. Bay look that promised more than it should, like a serpent hypnotizing its prey. And everyone knew the fate of those who let themselves be swayed. Their husbands disappear, one by one. No bodies were found, no crosses raised. Only silence, only whisper. In the saloon, more than one drunk swore to me. Thatch didn't kill them like an ordinary woman would. They said none of them were truly dead, that she buried them alive under the dry earth of her farm, letting the desert dust itself be the last thing they breathed. And these weren't just drunken tales. Some claimed that if you passed near her land on a high moon, you'd hear pounding sounds coming from the ground, nails scratching wood, muffled moans, pleas that the wind carried only as far as the roadside. I've never been one to believe everything they tell, but I've seen too much to doubt the impossible. Some said she walked among the graves as if strolling through a garden, that she knelt on the fresh earth and murmured words no one understood, banned, and that, as she did so, she smiled as if conversing with men who, underground, were still struggling for breath. I learned early on that in Red Hollow nothing stays buried forever. Not the truth, not sins. And back then, I already knew that sooner or later, my steps would lead me to her. But what really caught my attention weren't the whispers of the city. It was the sounds that the earth itself began to return. I was in the saloon when I first heard the rumors about the widow. The place smelled bitterly of cheap whiskey mixed with cigar smoke, and the out-of-tune sound of the piano tried to fill a silence no one dared break. But I realized the silence that night was different. It wasn't from exhaustion, nor from a hangover. It was fear. The men drank quickly, as if the alcohol could drown out memories. I watched from the corner of my eye, my hat pulled down low over my eyebrows, when one of them summoned the courage to speak. His voice was hoarse, broken, but filled with truth. "Sheriff, this isn't a children's story. Those lands over there, at night, they strike back." Another interrupted, swallowing hard, his hands trembling on the glass. "That's right. We pass by the road and listen. At first, it's just a faint sound, like stone hitting stone. But then, it's like fingernails scratching wood. And if you stand still too long, you hear voices. Men calling, gasping for air, asking someone to dig. The table of drunks suddenly fell silent, and their eyes turned to me. I didn't need anything else. I already knew. The fire in my chest told me before their words could dot My star began to burn against my skin, like a hot iron. It wasn't the heat of the lamp or my tired body. It was the curse. Whenever something more rotten than death itself loomed over Red Hollow, the star reminded me of the price I bore. No matter how hard I tried to forget, how much I hid behind empty glasses, the call always came. And it was always for me. I stood up slowly. The ground creaked beneath my boots, and each spur sounded like a sentence. No one said a word. I felt their gazes lower, their glasses returned to their lips, as if everyone wanted to believe there was still salvation in saying nothing more. But it was too late. The desert had called. I walked through the saloon door, and the night wind greeted me like an old enemy. It whistled through the windows, bringing with it the dry smell of dust and something else, a distant murmur coming from the direction of the widow's farm. The desert was breathing deeply, and I knew that breath wasn't coming from the earth alone. I tightened my horse's reins and mounted. Each thud of my hooves against the ground echoed like hammer blows on invisible coffins. I wasn't imagining it. I felt the vibrations in the air, as if the entire ground concealed a rotting, slowly beating heart. I'd seen a lot in Red Hologhosts, pacts, souls sold into the desert. But the widow's story carried another weight. It wasn't just about missing men. It was about men still breathing underground. It was about graves that wouldn't shut up. As I rode, I felt the weight of the star burn even brighter. It wasn't just a call. It was a summons, as if the very muffled thuds beneath the ground were calling my name. Elias Blackthorn, the cursed sheriff, the only fool condemned to hear and respond. And that night, as the wind swept the dust back and darkness swallowed me along the road, I knew I wasn't just visiting the widow's farm. I was encountering something much older, something that perhaps not even my revolver could silence. But what I found in that house, surrounded by silent graves, was worse than any story I had ever been told. Her house stood where the wind lost its courage, a rectangle of dark wood, faded by sun and dust, perched in the middle of a sparse lot, surrounded by nameless crosses. These were no ordinary tombs. They were crooked, uneven pieces of wood, hastily planted, as if someone were in too much of a hurry to say goodbye. They seemed to be watching the porch. They seemed to be watching me. I dismounted and dropped the reins onto the fence post. The animal snorted restlessly and dug its hooves into the earth, as if refusing to take another step. I walked through the dry garden. There were no flowers or anything alive, just a carpet of brittle leaves and fragments of exposed root. With each step, the ground gave off a strange, hollow sound, as if someone were digging underneath, very slowly, with malignant patience. The wood of the porch groaned as I climbed the first step, and in that groan I felt something that wasn't wind or weight. It was breath. The house breathed silently, in a slow rhythm, like a chest that insists on continuing. I knocked on the door with my knuckles. I didn't need to knock twice. The door opened on its own, stepping back in a courtesy that asked no one's permission. Then she appeared, black veil, dress lined like freshly ironed morning, skin that seemed untouched by aging. Her eyes were two calm, unhurried wells, like still water where promises sink. She smiled, and the smile had neither too many nor too few teeth it had. In fact, just the right amount to make a man want to see it again. Her voice came softly, tuned to the same tone as the processions. A funeral dirge she'd learned to whisper. "Come in, Sheriff." My husband's never left me alone. The star burned in my chest, discreetly, like an ember hidden beneath ashes. I inclined my head in a curt nod and passed. The interior had the cleanliness of an abandoned church. Nothing out of place, nothing visible with dust, and yet everything seemed covered by a layer of time. A sweet perfume wafted through, reminiscent of flowers that weren't there, perhaps imagined jasmine, perhaps a candle extinguished after a rosary. In the living room, a table was set for one, plate, a knife, a glass. On the chair opposite, a napkin folded in a triangle, waiting for a guest who wouldn't arrive with his legs. The house held small sounds, the creak of a beam, the creak of a worn floor, a ticking sound that didn't come from a clock, and beneath it all, a dull cadence, like when you put your ear to the earth and your body learns a beat that isn't yours. She walked ahead, her dress gliding without trailing dust, as if the ground wanted to be a path. "They still talk to me at nightfall," he said, touching the frame of an empty photograph. "Men are loud, Sheriff, even when they try to be quiet, and you answer." I asked, my hand resting near my holster, not out of threat, but out of habit. "I'll keep my promise at the altar. Until death do us part." The smile narrowed, and death, you know, is terrible at meeting deadlines. We followed a narrow hallway. To the right, a bedroom with a neatly made bed, sheets straightened, the imprint of a non-existent body on the pillow. To the left, an open closet displayed dresses pinned together, thread on spools, needles that gleamed as fine as stingers. At the end, a low door led to the kitchen, and beyond it, a trapdoor. She ran her hand over the wood, as if stroking a child's head, and didn't open it. I returned to the living room and let my eyes adjust to the afternoon's semi-glow, seeping through the cracks. On the walls, small, discreet crucifixes hung, unostentatious, on a shelf, dark glass vials, handwritten labels, camphor, opium, tincture of myrrh, and other names that prefer the shadows. On a sideboard, 3 gold wedding rings, aligned like moons in different phases. I touched one with my fingertip. It was cold, with a chill that didn't come from the metal. "You've lost a lot, madam," I said softly. "The desert asks for what it wants," he replied. I just answer. The front window framed the field of crosses. The wind blew through them, making a hissing sound that didn't quite match grasset, sounded like dry paper being crumpled. I smelled damp earth without any water nearby, a smell that often precedes storms or newly filled graves. My star warmed up again, slowly, like an animal raising its head when it smells danger. "The names?" I asked, pointing with my chin to the crosses. "They don't need to," she said. They know who they are, and so do I. There was a rough sweetness in the answer, the care of a gardener who speaks of plants by touch, not by name. I approached the door and returned to the porch. The horizon was low and thick, and the late afternoon had that antique copper color Red Hollow uses when night wants to come early. From where I stood, I could see, between the crosses, irregular marks in the earth, as if it had settled differently in certain spots. The kind of ripples that form when wood gives way under live weight. Behind me, she remained in the shadows of the room, where the veil seemed darkest. "Do you feel it?" he asked, almost in a whisper. "It's home, Dupree. When I breathe with it, I feel less alone." I took a deep breath and listened again. The same low cadence, the same breath lent to the walls and floor. It wasn't delirium. It wasn't superstition. It was the material of the place informing me that the world here had different rules. The wood spoke, but didn't use a voice. The earth moved, but didn't make a fuss. Everything moved inward, as if the house wanted to keep, not expel. I turned to her and met the two calm wells of her eyes. I saw no guilt in them. I saw certainty. The certainty of someone who believes they are fulfilling an agreement made without witnesses. She raised her hand and adjusted her veil with a small, everyday, almost domestic gesture. The gesture of someone lighting a lamp or folding a sheet. The normality of this care said more than any confession. "Can I see the backyard?" I asked. She nodded, and we walked side by side down the hallway again. He opened the back door, and the air rushed in like a warm creature. The yard was a cemented rectangle, and beyond it, the field of crosses began, unfenced, unmarked, as if the house were just the first part of a larger body. A shovel leaned against the wall, clean. Beside it, an overturned metal bucket, dry inside. Behind the ground, knee marks, fresh marks. I stopped. She stopped too. There was no embarrassment, no rush, no explanation offered. I felt the stars settle heavily on my chest, not burning, just reminding me of the weight of metal. I heard the wind pushing something beneath the earth, not a groan. Not a word, just the certainty of movement where there should have been none. And for a moment, the house seemed to take a deeper breath. I stood there, motionless, my hat shading my eyes and my coat touching the dust. Silence settled between us like a heavy towel. The widow kept her hands clasped before her belly, her fingers motionless, her veil pressed to her face by a barely perceptible breeze. We exchanged no promises, no accusations. We simply saw the yard, the house, the cross's end. Each of us knew what we needed to say. Silently, the full moon lay over the yard like a cold eye, watching over each nameless cross. I advanced among them, and the silence that reigned there was not one of peace, was one of waiting. Then came the first sound, low, dragging, like nails against wood. Another joined in, deeper, muffled. Soon there were several, a chorus of dull thumps rising from the earth. I knelt before one of the graves and pressed my palm to the ground. The heat I felt wasn't from the desert. It was human warmth, It was life trying to escape. I closed my eyes and listened more clearly. Voices mingled, some whispered, others stifled screams, names swallowed by the wind, pleas from men who still believed someone would hear them. The earth vibrated like a heaving chest, and with each beat I knew it wasn't delirium. Bear there, breathing beneath boards that should never have closed. Behind me, the widow approached. Her dark veil swayed gently, and her voice came low, almost sweet. They promised me eternity. I just made sure they delivered. I didn't need to look to understand. She meant it. There was no cruelty in her tone, only conviction. And that's worse than hatred. With each passing second, the sounds beneath the earth intensified, nails scratching, voices pleading. My fingers clenched the ground as if I could tear them away with sheer force of will. The star burned against my chest, pulsing along with those moans, reminding me that I wasn't just listening, I was being called. I stood up slowly, dust dripping from my clothes, and faced the widow. She smiled behind her veil, as if sharing an ancient secret. And the earth's chorus didn't stop. It continued to plead, to beseech. I knew then that there was no revolver or gunfire. I stood still for a few moments, listening to the pounding beneath the earth. With each passing second, it grew louder, closer, as if the buried men were trying to tear through the night to emerge. I reached for the revolver, but the star burned against my chest, reminding me that gunpowder is no use against a curse. Still, I kept my fingers close to the trigger. Old habit. The ground began to shake. The crosses swayed, and one of the graves gave way. From the earth emerged a thin hand, nails broken, clawing at the void. Then another, and then a whole arm, trying to lift itself. The wood creaked beneath my feet, alive, as if the entire yard were breathing. The widow watched silently, her eyes shining behind her veil. They belong to me, she said, her tone so calm it sounded like a prayer. I aimed the revolver without firing. What good would it do? Shooting at hungry arms wouldn't break the pact. I clenched my fists, touched the star, and felt the red light rise through my fingers. The entire yard shook, and the muffled voices echoed louder, almost deafening. It wasn't their choice, I said firmly. She just smiled. And in that smile I saw certainty, not guilt. The wind kicked up dust around us, and I realized this wasn't just a confrontation with a woman. It was with the desert itself, which doesn't forgive and never gives back what it takes. Now that they could silence that, the star burned in my hand as if hell itself had ignited within. I raised it against the widow, and the red light exploded across the yard, sweeping away the shadows and illuminating each nameless cross. What followed was not noise, but silence. The coffin lids gave way, and from each grave a final sigh rose. A heavy silence, broken only by the creaking of the wood that could no longer bear it. The men's struggle ended there, not in screams, but in a void that spread across the entire field. The widow let out a scream so piercing it seemed to come from centuries ago. Her figure trembled in the light, her veil burning into wisps that vanished into thin air. She fell to her knees, her fingers digging into the earth, trying to hold what was crumbling between her hands. But the pact fell apart before me. The husbands she had kept were no longer hers, nor anyone else's, only the desert's. I looked into her eyes for the last time and understood. She wasn't just a killer. She was a guardian. The face behind the veil showed no regret but certainty. The certainty of someone fulfilling a pact too ancient to be broken by weapons or men. I didn't kill her. I couldn't. She wasn't made of flesh to surrender to death. She was made a promise as I left that yard. The desert wind rose in thick dust, as if trying to erase my footsteps. Silence fell again, but it wasn't the silence of peace. It was the silence that waits, that watches. I knew. Red Hollow hadn't yet heard the widow's last breath. And perhaps by the time I do, it will be too late. And now I ask you, who have listened to this story to the end, what would you do in front of the widow? Would you dig to free the husbands, or would you let the earth keep them forever? Leave your opinion in the comments, because I want to know if you would have the courage to face what I saw. If this story gave you chills, leave a like and subscribe to the channel. Your presence keeps this fire alive in my heart. And before the Red Hollow night descends upon you, click on the next video that's already appearing on your screen. But do it quickly, before the earth starts whispering your name too.